What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode here on the Archi-Tech Network podcast. Today, we have our 39th podcast, and we've invited Jan Bunge to talk to us about the convergence of technology in the viz industry and far beyond. So Jan is a director at Squint Opera, and he spent a number of years in the viz industry, but he has this really interesting overview of the industry as a whole. And actually, one of the reasons I invited him on this podcast was he recently published a little paper called Feeding the Machines of Love and Grace. And it's a really nice synopsis of what is going on in the viz industry and some of the things that we need to think about in the future. I think it really summarizes a lot of the things that were on my mind and what a lot of other future thinking architects have on their minds. I definitely recommend maybe pausing the video here for 5 minutes, read through it. It's 8 pages. It's a really beautiful read. But of course, we're going to jump into a lot of these topics during the podcast. As always, if you enjoy this, give us a like and a subscribe. You can follow us on Instagram, where we're posting upcoming courses and future guests that we're going to have, as well as you can go right now to Archi-Tech.network and check out our online courses. Right now, we have our Grasshopper Master Plan online right now. But without any further ado, let's jump into the podcast and have a chat with Jan. All right, we are live. So Jan, thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited too.
Awesome. So to give a little bit of the audience a brief introduction to the one I've already done, I'll just kind of give them a little bit more of a flavor of your background. So, Jan, you're originally kind of trained as a landscape architect, right? And then transitioned to an urban designer, and you then eventually kind of found your way into the world of visualization. And you're now a director at Squint Opera, and you're also a director of SpaceForm, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. I also thought on your LinkedIn there's a good kind of way to also summarize yourself is you're a great networker of people, and I think there's a line where it says your network keeps you up to date with the latest technology industry trends, which you bring back in-house, pushing the boundaries of Squint's work. I thought that was also a great summary of of who you are. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to it, but I thought it'd be really interesting to start off by just talking about your journey to Squint from being like a landscape architect, an urban designer. How did your journey to Squint begin, so to speak? And your interest in, I guess, in the viz side of it, or as we just talked about, it's really the communication side of the AEC industry.
Yeah, it's definitely a somewhat unusual CV, I guess. You know, my first company actually was a demolition business before I started studying landscape architecture. When I think I enrolled when I was 23, and back then I really did not think it through a lot. I just went to the university and I thought I really have to study now. And I read the kind of summary page in the lobby of the Technical University in Berlin. And I literally started at A to figure out what I could study. And we did some demolition work outdoors, and there were lots of landscape gardeners around. And I always found them extremely nice people, kind of working with stones and plants and nature, and just very grounded kind of people. And so when I ended up at L and I read the short description for landscape architecture, and it had all these things like, all these different scales, designing, from object to regions, and a bit of sociology and a bit of biology and design. And it kind of read 80% interesting at the time. And I enrolled and very, very quickly became very passionate about it, because it really felt like something I started to care more and more about, this idea that, we could create some sort of almost like a framework or an empty shelf or structures for people to be. And as a landscape architect, you obviously always work kind of in between the buildings. So, shortly after I finished studying, I started working a little bit with Martha Schwartz, and she allowed me really to explore a lot of much larger scale master plan projects, and at the same time I did set up a landscape architecture studio in Berlin with a bunch of friends. And when this very well from architecture, but I guess the higher you go in scale, in the master plan world, we end up working on schemes for a bunch of years, and then it might take 10 years or 15 years before anything happens, really. Yeah. And so it became very obvious that you could kind of have the best idea in the world. If you didn't manage to communicate it right, most likely your project wouldn't go anywhere. It wouldn't survive these pressures.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And so, that I guess where, while I was still working as a landscape architect, I very strongly, felt that there were two moments where communication was super important. The first one was to win a project. So in Germany, if you have a studio in Germany, you're basically a competition architect, because the only way to win work, or the main way to win work, is through public competitions, and these are open competitions. So it is really all about, you have to have a great design and a great solution for the brief, but at the same time, I believe it's very much about how you actually present your work and how you communicate it. And then once you manage to secure a job, communication suddenly is really important to just keep everybody aligned and to keep the vision alive. Because as you know, at some point later down the line, there's a lot of pressures that, people want to cut budgets and timelines and make compromises. And if you don't have a strong narrative that describes your vision, then you don't have much to, fight for or stand on. Yeah. And so
it's a really good point, actually, because I think at school, like studying architecture, you're kind of informally taught it, but it's not, no one's really teaching you how to storytell or to communicate. Actually, it's just all focus on the design and learning to design. Okay. Which obviously makes sense. But it was actually one of the mistakes I made at uni was like, I just work and crazy. And we had a final submission and, worked till something ridiculous, like 2, 3 in the morning, presenting at 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning. And I hadn't even thought about what I was going to say. And you're just standing there wrecked.
Absolutely.
And, that's definitely something that's become more apparent as I've, been working in the industry.
I do sometimes teach, or I used to teach, in Berlin, and now I sometimes join friends who are teaching, and they mainly get me in to talk about exactly that point. And I feel there's two things that we're doing wrong. There's a lot of things we're doing wrong in architecture education, but maybe three things. I will just focus on three things. One, I feel we're not really doing students a great service if we don't teach them to collaborate with the other disciplines, because later in the real world, you have to, on a daily basis, work with architects and developers and city administrations, and often we don't even teach them the language, and so students don't really understand the pain points of an engineer or of a real estate developer or of a city, and I think it's really a wasted opportunity. There's very few courses, I think, on this planet where there's a truly integrated approach. And maybe to highlight a good example, I think at the GSD at Harvard, the project work is always structured in a way that an architect, an engineer, and a landscape architect has to work together, and they are all working on one project, over the semester. And I think that helps. It's the first step. So this kind of fostering an understanding across disciplines while you're studying, I think would be a good idea to focus on. And then the second one, is absolutely, communication. Help architects and designers to actually. I think that at Squint, we have this very clear understanding that the last thing people want to connect with, or the most difficult thing to connect, is kind of conceptual diagrams and conceptual ideas in general, and they're often very complex and really just quite large and quite difficult to digest, and so if you don't have a compelling narrative and you cannot tell a great story that excites people, then you're off to a bad start. And now the last thing that I always end up in discussing with architects and people who are teaching architecture at universities, the last thing I'm convinced of that's missing is we really also have to teach students to understand the economics of the business, because I find it very frustrating that we as designers, you're providing a service to a client, and this client might be a public client or might be a private client, but if you don't understand how your client makes money and where the pain points are for them and what they are worried about, then you will not provide the right service in the end. And I understand the worry in architecture education that you don't want students to focus on just the commercial side and so on. But right now, it's impossible to bring this up in many architecture schools. Like, this is the evil, don't mention money. You can't. It's just impossible, and that's just wrong. You have to at least be able to talk about it, and then people can make their own decisions.
Yeah, and I think it gets more interesting when you add that and like the business side, and we've talked a lot on this podcast about a lot of what you see at university are sometimes really interesting ideas and projects, but then they just you design things for a portfolio, but what if you could come out and turn that idea into a business, and understanding that business side, or entrepreneurship and raising money and stuff like that could be really beneficial for architects and and students in general to go out and with an idea, a business idea, rather than a flashy portfolio kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%. And then on top of that, and just to close this topic off, maybe there is, as you said, you can even go a bit further, where nowadays, if we are dealing with these highly complex projects that often have a component of whatever energy or mobility or things beyond just designing objects, they're performance related or lifespan related or material related. What if we could use those projects almost as pilot or test cases to try out new products and services, and then have some sort of pipeline where you can incubate ideas. And some studios are doing that, I think, started doing that. And I think it's definitely where it's going.
It's definitely a reoccurring theme that keeps popping up on this podcast. But so you kind of started to develop this interest in the communication side and the storytelling side, and that's I assume when you went over to Squint Opera. I also assume you're in Germany at that time, and then did you come over to Squint? You came over to London and started to join the Squint team.
It was a bit more messy than that. It is. So I used to have a studio, a landscape architecture studio, which still exists, called Treibhaus in Berlin, in Germany, together with 3 friends. And we never really managed to make enough work to sustain make enough money to sustain all of us. And so we all had to teach on the side, and we most of us had to have a little side job as well. And so because of the fact that I did my internship at Martha's, she, once in a while asked me to come and work on projects with her, which allowed me to, get exposed to a different scale and a different kind of project, but also it allowed me to just have a much more international exposure. And one of the projects that Martha was working on at the time was like 12, 13 years ago, was in Damascus in Syria. And me working on this project at the early stages really got me excited about working in Damascus in Syria, because honestly it was a massive challenge, to work as a landscape architect in this part of the world at the time, because they had just realized that there's a need to think maybe a bit more broadly about public realm and urban design, and this Syria and the whole region is arguably quite engineering driven, and when I first started going to Syria, the University of Damascus had just started the first year of an urban design course that didn't exist before, and they were just thinking about setting up the first ever landscape architecture course, and so it really felt like there was a need or a good reason for me to be there, and I guess I like a good challenge, and I ended up moving to Syria. I fell in love with a Syrian architect, and we set up a studio together, which we grew over a bunch of years, and just at the moment where it was starting to stabilize and we were starting to have paying clients, we had decided to only work with local clients just to make our life a bit more difficult on top of everything. and so it took a long while, but after 2 years or so, we just managed to have a bunch of paying clients and a bunch of good projects. And at this moment in time, the war started, and we didn't have a plan B, but it was obvious after a couple of months that nobody obviously wanted to continue working, and it became kind of a security issue, and I was stranded in Beirut together with my wife, and we literally did not know what to do until this old friend of mine called Jules, who used to run and still today is the CEO of Squint Opera. And Jules at the time needed someone to help him grow the business, and he asked me if I want to come to London and join the team and work with them. Yeah. And I think my first question was like, I was very flattered, but I was like, okay, why me? I'm not really a communication or film guy. And I think he said something along the lines of, you always work on complex projects with difficult clients. That's exactly what we do.
Yeah,
so,
I like that.
try it out. And back then I thought, I was up for the challenge, and it was lovely to be able to move to London and have a really interesting team and lovely people to work with. But I thought at the beginning, I'll do this for 3 years or maybe 5, and then I go back into landscape architecture. And this is now 11 years ago.
Yeah,
still there.
It's a great story though. It's a great transition from landscape to to communication and vis world. Interesting. So talk us a little bit about so I guess some people know the story, or maybe you could give the audience a quick overview of like how Squint started, because it was kind of very architecture. It was very linked to architecture. In fact, it was, it's on the about page. It was kind of embedded in Will Alsop's architecture firm, and it kind of is very interlinked with the architecture worlds. But it's kind of evolved over the last few years, right? And now I'd be, like you guys are doing all kinds of stuff, not necessarily, architecture based. I'm sure it kind of started off, doing visuals and stuff like that for architects, but now are architects your main clients, and how has it evolved from when you started there to now?
Yeah. When I started 11 years ago, it was a lovely studio within or adjacent to Will's studio. 20 years ago, Squint Opera was founded by 4 friends, of which 3 had studied architecture, but they didn't want to become architects. And one of them is one of Will's sons, Ollie, also. And I think back at the time, Will basically offered a bunch of chairs and a desk and said, you can sit in my office and figure out what it is that you want to do with your lives. And and they liked the idea of filmmaking, and so they started doing super experimental films with Will, and Will, who sadly passed away a couple of years back, but he in my view was maybe the most fearless architect that was around in the UK at the time, and he had this beautiful idea that work should be fun, work should be enjoyable, and he extended that concept to include the client. So I think one of the reasons why Will hasn't built a lot maybe is that he would walk away from a project if it wasn't enjoyable, and as you know very well, a lot of projects are not enjoyable.
Yeah, once you're out of the honeymoon period of projects.
Yeah, exactly. So I really I was fascinated by his approach. I knew Will from before a little bit, and he made a big impact on me, and had a big impact on the way I saw what people like him, I think what they are very good at, they just show you that other things are possible, and that you can find your own way of exploring this profession, and you can basically define your own rules in that game, and so in some way Will's DNA of being such a curious mind and so much into exploring and playing in some way. There's a lovely magazine that just came out in his memory, which is titled Serious Fun. That sounds it up quite well. He definitely had some serious fun in his studio, and so Squint Opera started making films around mainly kind of regeneration projects in the UK, a bunch of Will's projects to start with, and Will really allowed them to be playful and experimental, and then very quickly, I think, or at the very beginning, this idea was there that at this time, architecture communications was really crappy fly-throughs. That's in terms of film. That's what you could get. Because computers were just at this point, animation, 3D, was just starting to be attainable. At a smaller scale studio, and the quality was just appalling, and it was just very generic, and so. I believe that Squint really pioneered this idea that we should actually try to figure out what is actually the core narrative of this proposition. What is the core vision, and how can we articulate this vision in a compelling narrative, and how can we do that beyond CGI. So very early on, we started to add real characters into those films. I mean, first there's a narrative and a compelling story, but then 3D people is maybe also the worst at the time, right? I mean, you cannot connect with a 3D person. It just is not, emotionally, it's impossible to do that. And so the clients didn't ask for it, but Squint made a massive effort to add all these other elements to those films that made them more accessible and I think, allowed us to connect with the audience, on a different level than a pure kind of fly through could. And with many things, I think that Squint has done, it was kind of based on this fundamental curiosity that, anything at this time felt like an opportunity or anything felt interesting. So after the first couple of years when I joined, now we're maybe 20 people, and clients would come to us and they would ask for things that we had never done before. Like someone would come and say, can you do an interactive table at the time? Yeah. And a very new thing. And we never did one, but we thought, sure, we can figure out how to do an interactive table. And and we always had this belief that if someone asks for it, then it might be fun or it might be interesting to explore, but also, maybe there's a business there. Maybe this is something that will become something later down the line. And so Squint ventured into many different areas, just following those, requests or ideas or curiosities. Yeah. And arguably we maybe went a bit too broad at some point. We were running a bar and an event space and started a kids television show and, a lot of things. We had to rein it in a bit at some point, but I think it's still, very key to this business, this ability to explore and to, constantly adopt and constantly change. We maybe 8 years ago or 8 years ago, when we started doing these interactive installations, first for, cities or real estate developers, we then made the leap to go into the cultural world, working with museums, because we figured that, the museum world also will become more interactive and more immersive, over time. And now this is half of our business is creating immersive interactive experiences for museums and visitor attractions. And this goes from, working. I think the first big museum project we did was with the V&A when it was Hollywood Costumes was the exhibition, to doing all of the digital experiential stuff for the visitor experience at Empire State Building, or I think we just opened a visitor experience at Peak Tramways in Hong Kong. And so, funny enough, at the core, if you want to find a red thread that goes through all of that, I think at the core, no matter what we do at Squint, the core problem that we need to solve is that someone has a very complex, very complicated project or idea or historic event that they need communicating, and then you can kind of triangulate between the mission, like the topic that you have to communicate, whether this is how the First World War started or how this new city will look like, to the audience that you're talking to. So for some audiences it's better you do a booklet, or others would go with an interactive installation or an app, and then there's budget and timeline, and then somewhere within that you kind of figure out almost what the best tool is to communicate your need. And the beautiful thing about Squint today is that we don't have to sell one thing. It doesn't matter for the business whether it's a piece of strategic advice, a booklet, a book, an app, a film, an image, or a full immersive experience, or now more and more, we're creating real-time experiences in a kind of virtual twin sense, and so it is really one of the things that. So you said at the beginning, yes, when we started, our main clients were architects, and we did a lot of projects helping architects to communicate their projects. But then over time, it shifted. So today we have a bunch of architecture firms that we work closely with and we enjoy working with a lot. But then our main clients are often their clients. So these are city administrations or real estate developers on the architecture side. And for those clients, we can often engage with them from a very early stage. So, Squint went away from selling one-off smaller projects like just a film or just a bunch of images or just one app or something to, we managed to build longer-term relationships with a handful of clients who we would stay with for many years, and we would help them at the very beginning of a project, often before they have a real project. They maybe just have an inkling, they have a site, they have an opportunity, but they need someone to help them articulate this early vision, before there's any design, and just maybe someone to talk it through with, in many cases. But then if you look at the project timeline, every stage from then onwards requires you to communicate with a different audience, in a different way. So at the beginning, it's maybe an internal exercise to, sell the idea internally. And then the next thing is maybe you have to, raise a bunch of money, or you have to get permissions, or you need the public to buy in, or you need stakeholders to be excited about it. And so all of those stages until, you in the end often, you sell something to someone, or, there's some sort of operational mode where you now have to keep the excitement going. But each stage requires a different kind of communication, and it all has to do with, the audience that you're trying to reach, and the kind of context in which you are communicating these projects at those particular moments in the process.
Yeah, I guess that means you're pretty tool and technology and software agnostic, for each one of these things. And I was reading the new Mer book the other day, and I think at the beginning it's like the question that they got asked the most was, what rendering software do you use? And I'm sure that's a question you've been asked many times.
Yeah.
But maybe to zoom out and not only Squint, but the Viz industry has had a lot of disruption over the years. And for you guys, I think that's not so much of an issue, because you're very open and agnostic with your tools and technologies that you use. But I thought it'd be interesting to touch on, zoom out into the Viz industry as a whole, because, and I know you've talked about you wrote an article or something called "The Death of the Viz Industry," or the architectural Viz industry. And I think, with the rise of, real-time rendering, which is, tools like Enscape Twinmotion has kind of almost put the visualization process a little bit more back in the hands of architects, especially on a day-to-day basis, and the kind of big images and animations, we, still go to firms like yourselves, Squint. But then, of course, you've got the world of game engines and this new world in the metaverse that has come about. so like the viz industry has had a lot of disruption. Like,
Yeah.
how do you feel that's that how do you feel the viz industry? What's your take on the viz industry? And is it a little bit of a precursor to the architecture industry? Because you can see those same things coming that happens in the viz industry that's coming to the architecture industry with AI already. We didn't even mention AI as well, and Midjourney is also affecting both design and visualization. So, what's your view on the viz industry at the moment for the AEC space?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time, I think, and I think it's one of those things where you were maybe able to see this, and many, have talked about this maybe already 10 years ago, but it really feels to me like we are now at this, point of convergence that we have been kind of foreseeing for quite a while now. So on one hand, it feels quite slow, the transformation of the industry. On the other hand, it's now happening quite fast, I think, and it's quite a radical change. And as you said, it's not just the visualization industry; it's the whole industry, that is going to go through a massive, radical transformation in my view. So one way of looking at this, and this is maybe takes 2 minutes to a bit of a longer thought, but when I was thinking about this, over the years, I kind of came to the conclusion that if you want to look at any kind of major transformation in any industry, it kind of makes sense to follow the money, figure out, where actually is the money made, and what's happening in that part, because most likely that will influence the rest of the whole process. And so I got very interested a couple of years back into this idea of construction changing. So the way we build, the changes in the way we are building, I think is going to completely change the way we design and procure, build and operate, further down the line. And what I mean by this is that there's a bunch of things coming together. And so interrupt me if it doesn't make sense anymore, what I'm talking about, but I'll try. So let's just look at, if you just look at construction, I'm of the opinion, like many others, that the only, plausible future scenario for construction is that we're going to get to a kind of componentized, modular, in a off-site manufacturing process. And people are, discussing terminologies and, whether these are all the right words, but in principle, we're gonna manufacture components and assemble them in a factory to a size that we can put onto a truck, right? Yeah. And then from that, we drive those parts to the site, and then we have an on-site assembly line where we now put these boxes together to create bigger boxes, and then we stack them on top of each other, right? I mean, I'm simplifying, but so if that happens, then I think we are close to a future where, as a designer, as an architect, I will be doing a sketch on my iPad, and let's say I do a scribbly building early concept sketch on my iPad, and I think we're gonna have a layer of ambient computing that will run in the background, that at a very early stage will already start to figure out, okay, this kind of building, what are we looking at in terms of any parameter that's interesting for you for the design. So your carbon footprint, your supply chain, your material issues that you might run, timelines, budgets, down to how easy can we componentize this building, what's available in the supply chain, and then the system will make recommendations to how to tweak your design to either get it produced cheaper or faster. And so I think the one way of looking at this is that, and this is, I'm generalizing, and sure, you can poke holes into this, but the one way I look at it is that, I argue that in the first wave of digital transformation in the built environment, we forced architects and designers to become, kind of computer operators. We forced them to learn Rhino and Revit and Grasshopper and all these things, and then we also need them to be the project manager and all these things. And suddenly, there's very little time to actually design left, in your day to day. And I hope, or I think we have the opportunity to make the second wave that we are starting now, the second wave of digital transformation, all about kind of creating tools that allow designers to design again and to be creative again. And that maybe needs to be a bit widened, this understanding of the role of the architect or of the designer, because I feel on one hand, we will become much more curators, where we're going to have support systems that run in the background that give us options where we can, choose depending on, what we feel is the right choice. And so the design, the process of designing, maybe will become much more a process of curation. And then I believe that it becomes more and more important, all the things that you have to do as an architect, which are very much related to aligning with stakeholders and everybody who's involved in the process of making buildings or cities. So this is your skill to mediate, to translate, to communicate, really, that I think will become more and more important, because the complexity of the problem is only going to grow, right? So we used to look at everything in the built environment in isolation, right? We have these expert silos. We have people who are only looking at buildings, or only looking at the energy systems, or only mobility, or only water, whatever system. And at some point we realized, and then we kind of became very good at these silos. We optimized within the silo, and we have expert knowledge, which is super important. We understand what we're doing when we're building a building, or when we're looking at energy systems or mobility or whatever. And then at some point we realized that there's obviously a very strong relationship between all of them. So a lot of them are connected. And now we're starting to realize that in the future, all of these systems and processes actually have to become circular. So they have to become truly interconnected. So someone's waste is someone's material, or someone's energy, and then this, these new, or these old challenges, that we're facing. We can only solve this question of decarbonization, or generally speaking, this question of how we can achieve a more sustainable presence on this planet. We can only achieve that through a truly integrated approach, and we are far away from that at the moment in the industry, because we're still educating in silos, and we are still operating in silos. And even if people, and I was on so many, when I was still landscape architect, and even today, I've been part of so many large teams that, would present themselves to the client as an integrated team where everybody works together. It's all bullshit, right? Because
it's like every architecture firm, their about pages, award-winning, multidisciplinary.
Yeah, exactly.
so.
But when it comes down to it, the problem is that you work with a bunch of engineers and finance people and whoever you need to have on that team, and when it comes down to it's very competitive, because in the end we are all competing for one budget, and people also compete on, who actually has the last say, who can actually make the decision. So we haven't aligned the incentives. I've been on many projects where I tried to have this conversation in the first week of a new project, when I thought the client was up for exploring this thought, and I would introduce this idea. I would say, what if, so at the moment, if a project takes longer, I, as a designer, I get more money. If it is more expensive, I get more money too. So maybe these projects take a bit longer and they get a bit more expensive, right? Because it's kind of human nature. And what if we flip this around and we would say, at the beginning of a project, we define like a baseline, like a target. We want, X amount of, the square meter should cost X, and the timeline should be Y, and we want to try and hit this sustainability, parameter, whatever, or we go for BREEAM, whatever, whatever the targets are. But we define those targets and make this the baseline, and then we say, okay, if we reach as a joint team between everybody, if we reach this target, this is your base fee. This is what you get. If you exceed your target and you bring it in faster, cheaper, with a higher performance in terms of sustainability or energy performance or whatever you defined at the beginning, then the team gets more money, because we're splitting the gains, and I feel like that's what's missing at the moment. I mean, one of the things that's missing is the incentives are just not aligned in the right way to foster true collaboration and to foster innovation. And then the last problem, and then I will stop talking about problems, but the last frustrating problem, I think, is the fact that in the built environment, if you look at how things get financed, and this is obviously true for any investment, the industry spent a lot of time managing the risk out of these investments. So if you want to build a residential building today, there's a very clear investment logic behind that, right? And obviously, from a pure kind of investment capital perspective, I want to de-risk my investment. So we have now systems in place that have completely de-risked the investment, which is great for the investor. But it created this situation where we cannot introduce any new elements. We cannot introduce a new material or a new process or a new system, because the moment you try to do that, the financial model will not work anymore, because it's a risk management problem where
you've increased the risk. So
you increase the risk because you don't have 10 years data. Exactly. So in return, we stick to what we know and everything looks the same. And we can't get out of that problem, because you can only repeat what we already know. And so I'm really struggling to see how we're going to get out of that, because we definitely need to find a way to build better and more efficient and better performing and all of that. And so all of that, in my mind, is very much connected to this fundamental question of, is creating buildings and cities, is that a short-term investment where you cash in the moment that the building is built, or is this actually a long-term commitment where we should actually start to look at these projects as not as 5 to 10 year investment horizons, but 10 to 50, and include the whole life cycle of the building, because then
multi-generational,
exactly intergenerational wealth, right? And then it makes sense. Then the whole logic makes sense, because then it makes sense to invest a bit more money at the beginning to design better, to build better, and to maybe introduce, decentralized ways of producing energy or water or whatever you can do on your site, because you will get the money back in operations because you are saving money in operations. And if you design better, people will stay longer and you have less headache running the building. And at some point you paid for your solar panels and the energy becomes free. And if you design well, then you might have extended the lifespan of the building by 10 years. And that's money right into your bottom line. But it only works if you keep the asset. And if you really change your business model to, a fully integrated, model that looks at it from the beginning until, we are recycling the materials and putting them back into the loop. That really is a massive shift that needs to happen. But I completely diverted from the question, but maybe going back to.
I think it's a great dovetail to talk about your paper, and so many of the things you've talked about is been really on my mind as well, and these same kind of ideas and observations that we're seeing in the industry, and I guess this is kind of what led to you putting this on paper, right? And with your paper, Feeding the Machines of Loving Grace, which is kind of, that was also one of the many reasons I wanted to invite you on here, because I saw you posted it the other day. I saw it on LinkedIn and I read through it and I thought it was like a great, I've got it here, it's a beautiful 8 pages of distilling this into very concise and understandable chapters, many of which we've covered now already, but yeah, so maybe should I read the first couple paragraphs just for the audience to get an idea of it, and then maybe we could continue this, because I think this is a great dovetail to what you're saying. So you released this a couple weeks ago now, right?
Yeah.
Feeding the Machines of Love and Grace, Saving the Planet One Simulation at a Time. The challenges we are facing in the built environment are huge. Hence, we have to radically update our current processes and systems to better design, build, and operate our buildings and cities. Today, we are happy if our cities are not bad for us. In the future, buildings and cities have to become productive, and we will measure their success on how good they are for us. Economic pressures combined with climate change avoidance and adaptation strategies will change the face of our cities and landscapes. Strategies for decarbonizing our existence are urgently needed on a global scale. And that's the first paragraph, and you basically break it down into each of these chapters, which we've discussed on a little bit already. I'll put this also in a link to the video so people can also read this. I highly recommend it because I think it just sums up, some very, very astute observations of what's going on in the industry. So what kind of led you to putting this on paper and publishing it now? And, what was your kind of drive to put it out there?
I guess it's frustration. It's kind of, it comes from me from quite a negative. But it's I think I have both, right? On one hand, I, having worked in the built environment for 20 years now, I often have touched the limits of what is possible, and often found myself in this position where computer says no, and everybody agrees we should be doing it, and the client agrees and everybody's up for it, but then when it comes down to it, it's not happening. And so fundamentally, the fact that we have split the process in these two distinct phases, where there's a design phase where, we develop a vision and a design and come up with a great concept. And and then when that phase finishes, then, we give the idea to, let's say, a contractor, and suddenly it's all about buildability, budgets and timelines, right? And that is really the Excel sheet suddenly is a designer of this project, and that's why a lot of things don't look the way they were designed, because we have split this into these two phases, and and I really very strongly feel that one part of the solution is that we have to combine these two phases into one, and we have to kind of tackle those problems that we now are deferring to a later stage and putting onto the contractors or the client's desk. We have to deal with them at the beginning when we're designing, because we can. And I mean, Big is such a good example. I was, when Big started, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see the origins of Big is very much rooted in this idea that the first projects that you built, they didn't have great budgets, and they were partly social housing, and there were a lot of constraints, but you were aware of those constraints, and you worked with them, and you head on kind of dealt with it, and created the most until today most iconic kind of first 3-4 projects. But I think it was a mixture of you had a good client, and you were able to at the same time just not ignore these challenges, but work with them and work with the constraints. And I think that's what as designers, I think that's really the mission, is to embrace all of those constraints and not be afraid of the business model and the numbers and the engineering side and the performance, but it's we need to head on deal with it.
It's a point that not a lot of people get about the origins of Big. You think these architects just happen to meet some really rich people that want to do everything. But
exactly,
I think one story that's quite interesting of those early buildings, the VM house, that has two quite interesting features. One is the apartments are duplexes, which means that you only have a corridor every 2 floors, and thus, from a development's perspective, you're halving the amount of non-sellable area in the building, right? So that's an interesting little design feature. And now each of those apartments has this really beautiful double height space, et cetera, et cetera. The other one, which became the icon, in fact, it's right behind me there. I just realized as I'm talking about it, that the balconies on the projects were originally like rectangles, and it had 2 kind of cables going back into the facade to keep it up. And I think that the budget was like for the balconies was 50% too high. It was almost double what they needed. So they decided to just take away one side of it and make the balconies triangular in order to meet that budget, and that became the icon of this very picture right here. So a lot of people don't understand that the early projects were, they were creating something incredible out of nothing. It was a very affordable budgets and developments.
And exactly. And I really believe that, this is having had the pleasure to work a little bit alongside Martha Schwartz, this was a landscape architect who, most of her iconic projects are on top of parking garages and had almost no budget. So she had to use, cheaper materials that were not used commonly in landscape architecture. She had to find creative ways of dealing with this. And I really believe that, this is when creative minds thrive, is, when we are dealing with constraints, right? The worst thing you can give a creative is a completely open brief and unlimited budget. It's never going to lead to anything good. But, I feel like, this is the task at hand is, we have to embrace all those challenges, and we have to, wrap our heads around it. And then I am really quite optimistic around, this second wave of digital transformation, where tools will help us. Digital tools will help us to deal with this complexity, and this will happen on many different layers and at different levels. I think on one hand, we have arrived in a world where we can have a real-time 3D model in a game engine, and whether this is Epic Games, Unreal Engine, or what NVIDIA is Omniverse. These systems are just getting better, at a rapid speed, and so there is this kind of backbone infrastructure, if you like, that is almost like I would think of it as a platform that we can plug in, all the different tools that we need. But there's this one moment of truth, a bit what the promise was with BIM, from an engineering perspective, right? But now I think we're really getting somewhere where so now we can have this integrated 3D model, which is this one moment of truth where I can plug in all the different simulations and all the different data sources that are relevant, that are informing my design. And then we're seeing a rapid increase in what I call support algorithms, that are just made to quickly test an assumption and quickly figure out what are the how can I improve whatever the structural grid or ventilation or light. So I think these on one hand I think that we now have platforms that I believe have to be open and they have to be able to accommodate any kind of plug-in or tool that we want to add to them, and then we have a bunch of algorithms that will help us navigate that. And the problem with algorithms, just maybe one short exploration on that topic, is because it was quite funny for me. Maybe 10 years ago, when the first engineering firms realized that algorithms are actually going to have an impact on their work and on their business, I think there was an euphoria, and everybody thought this is going to be amazing. We have 30 years of data. We have all this data. We're going to just feed all this data and we're going to create all these amazing algorithms. And then everybody realized a bit later that just having all this data doesn't get you anywhere, because it's all unstructured data. It's all, it's not curated data sets. And so you can't actually train algorithms with these data sets that we have, broadly speaking. And what you need to do is get your best engineers to structure this data and to curate it properly, because otherwise you put shit in and get shit out. I mean, we're not quite there yet that we can just throw all this unstructured data at it. And so now I think what we are going to see is tools that will generate structured data while they are used. So in the day-to-day design process, and then over time these support algorithms will learn from this input and become really smart assistants. And it's a bit like a design crit that we have in universities, where you're just gonna have a Clippy.
I keep going on about Mr. Clippy of BIM or something. Yeah. It will be the first introduction that tells you, hey, this is not building regs friendly, but you're, it's that kind of essence of using these tools and technologies to automate the things that we don't necessarily, that takes a lot of our time, that we don't necessarily have to, spend so much time on. If we can automate, that would free us up to actually do where we make the most amount of impact, which is, creative design thinking and problem solving on a creative level.
Exactly.
And I think that's where, a couple of your chapters touch on this subject of like, what do you call it? Ambient computing to help creatives create again. Yeah, I think, and you do see this now with the rise of Midjourney and DALL-E and this kind of stuff is like, now you don't need to be able to code to use these things. It's good to be able to, because you can kind of get under the hood a little bit, but you can now generate buildings and use AI with no coding experience. It's just
and the interesting thing is that we're just at the beginning, right? At the moment, it's playful and it's artistic, and it's
almost like, oh, this is a fun little thing, but then
exactly
what's on the horizon is very different.
Very different, because once we have those structured data sets to feed into it, then this becomes extremely useful as a design tool. And so I have another little obsession. So I'm a landscape architect, right? And if you and I would be to design a park together, I mean, what would we do, right? We would use three things, we would communicate using three tools, so we would talk about it, right? I would say, I like this park in Barcelona, and we talk back and forth, and we use voice, we use words, which arguably are code, since natural language processing has evolved a fair bit, you can think of it as a kind of code input, us talking about it, and then maybe we show each other reference images, and I would say, I look at a bit like this, I like this edge or this bench or whatever, this geometry, and you show me some images, I show you some images, and we kind of circle into having sort of understanding about the style, and then maybe we do very simple sketches, like super basic sketches, very big pen, a bit like this, a bit like that, and by just pinging this back and forth between us, talking about it, reference images, simple sketches, we go deeper into the design, and as we progress, we detail it in our minds, and at some point we can build a detailed 3D model of the park that we want to design together, and now we have it designed in 3D, and then we can run the simulations and figure out how to optimize whatever the drainage and all that stuff, and so this exact process, in my lifetime, I believe I will be able to go through that process with a machine. I can have that conversation with a computer, and I can say, and we already have all the elements there, right? There's speech input for game engines, so you can control game engines by talking to them. There is tools that are interpreting your simple sketches, and there's tools that are matching reference images to sketches, all the gun stuff, and so I feel like that is super exciting, because in theory, we should be able to manage much better these really complex environments that we have to design in, because we actually have a much better insight into the reality that we are dealing with, and the tools to kind of quickly iterate and quickly test, and this whole idea of virtually testing an environment before we physically build it. I mean, that's really also what at Squint Opera. I mean, that's really where most of our work today is focused on building those virtual twins. I'm still struggling to find the right word. It says maybe it's a digital experiential twin.
Become a bit of a buzzword already, the digital twin.
And it's maybe too engineering heavy, the word. But anyway, the idea is it's a somewhat old idea in a way that but now we are actually able to, for the first time, I think in history, we're able to truly test designs virtually before we built them, and this I had this moment, I mean, we've been playing around with this idea started maybe 6-7 years ago. And, it was actually, I think I was on a call with Bjarke back then, and we were working on a project together, and the design had just changed. And he was on a video call in Copenhagen, and I was in London, and he was trying to explain to me how the design had changed. And he did a little sketch on a piece of paper, and he tried to show me on the camera, and he's like, it's a bit like this, right? This was maybe 7 years ago. And we were both like, somehow this feels wrong, right? This cannot be the way we discuss spatial conditions in our day and age. And then we started at Squint. We applied for a bit of funding, and we started a little research project to figure out whether we can build a virtual collaborative workspace in real-time 3D, which then years later turned into what's now SpaceForm.
Which was kind of like the last port of call I wanted to touch on, because that's where you and I kind of met, really, is the birth of SpaceForm and our collaboration with us and what you guys did at SpaceForm. And I was going to get you to tell that story, because I thought it was that was the story that created SpaceForm.
Absolutely, and this was one really important moment. And then later, when we were building the first prototype, when we realized that if you are designing digital experiences in physical spaces like we do in the exhibition world, right, then it's really complicated to explain to a client what the difference is between the content on this screen size or that screen size, and this content versus that content, and how it will feel differently in the space. And at some point we started to use this real-time environment to mock up our digital designs for those exhibition spaces. And the moment we allow the client to be in that space and they could stand there in a one-to-one scale, and we could flip, this screen versus that screen, or this content versus that, and suddenly, they felt like they could actually make a better informed decision. And I think that's the key point. Is like, non-technical people can make better decisions now because they can virtually experience those spatial conditions before we built them, right? And that's just mind-blowing, I think, because what this means is that on one hand, I mean, it's great with clients because they actually feel much more secure when they're making a decision, because they actually feel like they tested it virtually and they experienced it properly. But also you can extend this to things like public participation, right? Where suddenly I'm of the opinion that we are all spatial sensors, and we all have the ability to sense spatial conditions. Like, I enter a space for the very first time, I immediately have a feeling, and in that moment, I form my opinion, right? And so arguably, the most important thing is how people feel in these spaces that we create, and that's the moment someone feels it, that's kind of when the success or the failure of this project gets defined, by that emotion, because then I form an opinion and I tell my friends, and it's either it's a success or people don't like it, and so if that's at the core of everything, then maybe we can use these simulation technologies and these real-time environments to really allow people to have a much more eye-to-eye discussion, like allow non-technical people to have a more kind of level discussion around the dimension of this room, whether it's a 4-meter height or 6-meter, what is the difference, and it is just so, I think it's really amazing, I've been in many public consultation meetings where, you always feel the same way. It's like you're presenting non-technical people who didn't study architecture, and many architects struggle, to do this exercise. But you're presenting something in a 2D format, on a plans and sections and images, and maybe you have great renderings and you have a great film and all of that. But then you expect people to be able to imagine themselves in that space and then imagine how it would feel. That's just impossible, for most. And so it's just not, you're not really getting any valuable feedback because you haven't empowered the people you're showing it to actually, have an opinion. They can't, in most cases. And now this is different, where anybody can jump into these environments and you can feel, okay, when I stand here at this corner, this is the difference between this being a 5-story building or a 50-story building. And this is how the shadow looks like at noon. And this is how it looks like in winter or when it rains, or all this is happening in real time, right? And so I really feel like we're just at the beginning of something, and I don't know what to call this. I don't know, it's a complicated topic because, the role of the designer, is an important one, in my opinion, in the sense that, you want to also push the boundaries and you want to create solutions that, people maybe were not able to imagine, but to have a more integrated design process where we actually tap into the spatial intelligence that all of us carry in us, in my opinion, can only be a good thing.
Yeah. No, I think there's there's some really interesting. There's a lot of interesting points there of like, so much of the stuff that's in your paper, and this was, this is kind of the long format explanation of what SpaceForm is, right? And I'll also put in the link, and I'll put up some little videos of what the current version of SpaceForm looks like, but. This is one of your other endeavors that you and I have worked on together a bit, and you can really see that in the tool, like the future of it. We're at this point where all these things are converging. The game industry, AI, a few things. Blockchain. We haven't even mentioned blockchain, but that's coming in. That's in there as well. Digital simulations. The Omniverse. I think we briefly mentioned the Omniverse, but that's another one. If those of you that are listening that haven't heard about NVIDIA's Omniverse, that's one that, is mind-blowing in itself. We're at a super interesting point where like all these things are converging right now. Yeah. And as you said, when we touched on the, AI, Midjourney, all that kind of stuff, it's literally just getting going, and it feels like it's going to move very quickly. But I think it is a really interesting, and that's why, it's not just about the viz industry or the architecture industry. It's all of these things as a whole. It's a really interesting time, and I think we're going to see a lot of disruption in this space. There's so many other chapters we could touch on your paper, but I'll put it in the link, and I think it's great. I highly recommend everyone that's listening to read through it. It's only eight pages, and it's really, really beautifully written and easy to understand. Maybe as a kind of leaving point is, to young architects listening and architects listening that are kind of, excited, but maybe also a little bit nervous about all these things. What do you think? What advice would you give to young architects, or either architects that are graduating soon, or architects that are thinking about starting their own practice? What kind of nuggets of advice would you give them, and what kind of things are you also super excited about? It can be something specific, like the Omniverse, or something general.
I'm generally excited about too many things. That's very fair to say, but the and that is maybe also the core message, I think, is that every phase. So in my mind, it works like this. It's like, okay, there's massive challenges that we have to overcome in the built environment. There's environmental challenges, there's economic challenges, and there's a lot of moving parts. And what on one hand, this can be scary. On the other hand, this is also means that there's massive opportunities. If you start thinking about, if we are in any way serious about trying to decarbonize our presence on this planet, then everything has to change. Like everything has to change. Like every material, every process, every system, and that is, I think, super exciting because it's about time for things to change. So I think the thing that works the best, I think, is to really try to explore as many things as possible and then listen to yourself and figure out, what you're personally most excited about. And this might be something that is maybe not on vogue or maybe, not everybody's thing, but I think the key thing, if you're starting your career is very much about, you have to be comfortable in that topic and you have to be excited about it. And you cannot be, excited about it because someone else is excited about it. And it's finding that thing that resonates with you. And I think the beautiful thing is, and that's what drew me to, landscape architecture in the first bit, but same with architecture. I think the beautiful thing is that you can find these things in every scale. And so this could be almost on a molecular kind of material level. There's so much exciting stuff happening when you think about, regenerative materials, from mycelium to hemp to, whatever, anything that you can imagine that can grow fast. We should try to figure out if we can 3D print it or, quickly manufacture something from it. And so there's a lot happening on the kind of really building block material kind of level. Down all the way up to systems and processes of how we're gonna co-create, how are we going to share IP, how are we going to incentivize, align incentives, how are we going to educate in the future, how do universities have to change, and everything in between, and I really feel unbelievably excited about the time that we are in now because, this every challenge that we are facing equals a massive opportunity at the same time. Yeah. And we just have to find our place in all of that and then play to our strength and, figure out where we can have the most impact. And which is a very personal decision in the end.
I think that's a beautiful way to conclude the podcast, and it's also the conclusion to your I think excitement amongst the people who will literally build our future. And I think you're right. It's whilst there is a lot of change and a lot of things going on right now, there's a massive amount of opportunity in an industry that has a huge amount of disruption that positive disruption that is capable of. So I think we're in a super interesting time for architects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is it's almost like there's a backlog. There's this graph, right, that you can draw if you compare all industries on this planet, how they manage to become more efficient and more productive over time. And the poster chart is the automotive, when you can say how car production has become so much more efficient over time. And then but if you map everything that humans ever have done on an industrial scale, you will get a curve that generally has improved our performance. And then you map construction against that, and that's the only thing that managed to get a little bit worse over 50 years.
Yeah.
So it's insane.
A quote I keep using is I read somewhere a year ago now, that the construction industry is one of the few industries to decline in efficiency over the last few decades. It's like, that's mad.
It is really mad. And that's why there's so many opportunities there. And this is also why, Big, I think, has started Neighbor, another project maybe to put in the list, where, we're rethinking, the way things are built and operated. And I think that there's another interesting question there, maybe the last one, that is, interesting to think about, is this question of, and I'm generalizing, but you could almost argue that through this ability to mass customize and to, have this, rapid prototyping and modular construction, or whatever you want to call it. What also, could happen is that we start to see architecture almost like a product, buildings like a product, and then citizens become almost customers of that product. But in a sense, what that means is that it also means that the end user is, any product that gets designed and developed at this moment in time constantly runs through, closed feedback loops, and it's an iterative process. It's never finished, right? But it always gets improved. And then there's a new version that comes out next year, which is, lighter, cheaper, better, whatever. Yeah. And we haven't seen these cycles of innovation or improvement in the built environment at all. But I think we might be at the beginning of a similar process where we can allow customers, people who are buying or renting apartments or office space, first we can almost co-design with them, because they can virtually test, in these platforms, and they can virtually be part of this design process. And then once, we agree what is going to get built, then, we can measure the performance of the as-built unit, and then we can go back to it next year and learn from it and build the next iteration in a better way. And so really learning from our past, which is something we just have not done enough at all. I mean,
it's almost taboo as an architect, right? It's like we only design bespoke stuff, and then it's we throw it away, and you can't do that again, because it's like, that idea is done. It's mad.
It's crazy. It's mad.
And we've already talked about it. You see, like, when that Big or Zaha or something posts a project, you often see comments that people are like, "Oh, it looks so Zaha, it looks so big," as though like you have to reinvent your approach or style like every time. But then you wouldn't say that if you saw a new Ferrari driving by. You wouldn't be like, "Oh, another bloody red Ferrari." Like,
yeah, but it's also the other example, I think, is like research, right? If you think of it as a discipline, as a scientific discipline, which it is to a degree, I think, where you would also argue that a researcher would never just neglect all the other research that's out there, but you build on top of it, and that's the whole point, because otherwise it'll never get better. So in some way, there's a utopian kind of future vision, I think, where what if we could open source all this knowledge that is in architecture practices. And there have been attempts like WikiHouse and a bunch of other smaller attempts to try and create this shared knowledge space. But I find it just ridiculous that any architect, we should never be, nobody needs to draw a window detail. I'm sure we have drawn enough window details on this planet. Like we just have a library of all window. And maybe if someone comes up with a new way of drawing a detail, there has to be a system where this can be, get the top of the pile. But in principle, it feels like we're missing a trick by not sharing, this knowledge and not building on top of it and really encouraging people to use it and to build on top of it. And I think the core to that problem, and this is not just in the architecture industry, but it's all creative industries. I think the key to that issue is a way to share the IP, and that's when I do hope that blockchain technology might play a small part in that, where we can actually track everybody's contribution on the public ledger, and then we can allocate value to this contribution, and therefore there's a shared incentive in kind of collectively improving solutions.
That's super interesting. Yeah.
Let's see. It's definitely not going to get boring.
Yeah, for sure.
Next 10 years.
No, this has been super interesting, and thank you so much for writing this paper and publishing it. I think it's great. We'll definitely republish it. And I think also to touch on that knowledge sharing, that's very much why we started ATN, is to share knowledge around, for us, it's architecture, technology, a bit of entrepreneurship, and like I said, talk about these subjects and share things. So I know our audience is going to really enjoy this conversation, and thank you very much for joining us. Maybe to just let the audience know, where's the best place to reach out if they want to, talk to you or get in touch. We can put in your LinkedIn profile.
LinkedIn is good. LinkedIn is good. Perfect.
We'll put that in the link below along with the paper. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It was really fun. Let's continue this conversation soon.
For sure we will. Well, thank you once again. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another podcast. We're not sure who it's going to be yet, but it'll be interesting. But for now, stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next one. And thanks again, Jan.
Cheers.
Cheers.